Exactly.
So if it's okay, I think we'll get started. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'd like to get started. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelco. I have the privilege of directing the Environmental Change and Security Program. On behalf of my colleague Andrew Seeley of the Mexico Institute, it's a thrill for us to have today's session, which we've entitled Decentralization and Democratization of Natural Resource Management, a program that came to us in the form of Jesse Ribot, who you will hear from to kick off the discussion when Jesse was a fellow here at the center. It was terrific to have him here in residence. It's always kind of a luxury to have all this in-house talent that we get every year in the form of fellows here at the Wilson Center. And so this was a discussion that we started some years back, and it's, as you will see, a product of a many years research program. And so it's terrific that we will have a chance to really delve into this today. Just a quick word about the Wilson Center, and I'll try to be very brief because, as you see, we have a full lineup. The Wilson Center is the former memorial to Woodrow Wilson, so a forum to bring the worlds of scholarship and policy together on a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis. The Environmental Change and Security Program is a 14-year-old program that tries to do that in the issues of environment conservation, development, health and population, and even foreign policy and security policy. You'll hear shortly from Andrew Seeley as a discussant, so I'll let Andrew say a word about the Mexico Institute as well. I will say that we're webcasting the event live, so when it comes to the discussion period, if you could wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a microphone and state your name and your questions to the mic so our folks online can benefit from that. I'm going to keep the introductions very brief. You will see that we've passed out bios in the handouts along with the participants list. But it's terrific to welcome Solange Bandiaki, who is PhD candidate in Women's and Gender Studies at Clark University. Solange and I were in New York recently, met for the first time, so it's terrific to see her again so soon and here at the Wilson Center. Ashwini Chaudhry is Assistant Professor of Geography at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, a place that I have a place in my heart for since I was born there when my dad was doing his PhD, so it's terrific to always have the Illini in the house. Uma Lele is a visiting professor, Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland, and she will be one of our discussants along with Andrew Seeley this afternoon. Last but not least, Jesse Ribot, who will kick us off, is a senior associate in Institutions and Governance program at the World Resources Institute, someone who's just been to Durban, South Africa, talking the UN Forest meeting where these issues were front and center, so we're eager to hear what they all have to say. So Jesse, why don't we turn the floor over to you?
Thanks very much, Jeff. It's a real pleasure to be back at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I just want to start by thanking Jeff and Andrew Seeley and Gib Clark, where's Gib? Gib's in the room somewhere close by, and Arisha Ashraf from WRI for helping organize this event. It's a lot of work that goes into putting a little 2-hour meeting together. I also want to acknowledge several supporters of this program, the program called PROFOR, which is the World Bank Forestry Program, USAID's EGAT, Economic Growth, Agriculture, and Trade Division, as well as money from the Dutch, Royal Dutch Embassy in Dakar, supported some of the research that went into this project. But I also wanted to start by paying a very brief tribute to one of the members of this research program, Nathaniel Gerhardt, a young colleague, researcher who put his creativity in at the very beginning of the program, put a lot of energy in when we were just framing the concept paper. He was an intern with us at WRI. And Nathaniel died tragically about a year ago in the summer, August of 2007 in Indonesia in a motorcycle accident. So he wasn't here to see the end of the program. And the publications of this program are all to be dedicated to his memory. Andrew was a very bright and committed young scholar, and we will miss him. So, today, the talk that I want to give really cuts across several research programs over a long time, but it's hard to condense this into 20 minutes. Most developing countries right now are engaged in some form of democratic decentralization. And many of them, if not all, I haven't found any that does not claim to also be decentralizing some aspect of natural resource management. These decentralization reforms aim basically to create a situation that is more equitable, more efficient, more effective at implementing projects on the ground. And we set out about 8 years ago, but really in terms of fieldwork 6 years ago, to understand what are the effects of decentralization on natural resource management, and what are the effects of these decentralizations on the formation and consolidation of local democracy and local democratic process. Now, the focus on the effects on natural resource management was the earlier research programs, and the one we're going to talk about today is more focused on the effects on local democracy. The three programs were called Decentralization Through a Natural Resource Lens. It was a comparative research program in 15 countries that was run by World Resources Institute. A second program called Commodity Chain Analysis as a Policy Tool, 12 case studies trying to look at the economic decentralization aspects. That is, in parallel to a political and administrative decentralization, did you see greater retention of benefits in markets that originate in rural areas? And the third was called the Politics of Choice and Recognition in Democratic Decentralization. Started out with 17 case studies, ended up with 9 being finalized, and this was a kind of reconnaissance research program to test a framing and an analytic approach to the effects of decentralizations on local democracy. So today, we are delighted to present to you the most recent results of this choice and recognition program. This program has also produced a number of articles, 9 working papers. They're out on the table. They're also on disk you can take with you. And the group of papers is coming out in a special issue of Conservation and Society that should be finished within about a month and published. It'll be nice to see that out. Also, a policy brief, which is in draft form out on the table, which we would love your comments on. It was supposed to be finished for this meeting, but as you all know, not everything gets finished when it's supposed to. In the introduction here, I'd like to just introduce the analytic framework, evoke a selection of findings from the project, outline some of the key recommendations that we were making, and then hand the floor over to my colleagues Ashwini and Solange to talk to you about case studies in India and Senegal that really illustrate this framing. So, choice and recognition, what is this? What does it mean? It's a framing for analyzing the democratic or democracy effects of natural resource decentralization. I originally chose the term choice because I want to attribute responsibility or agency to those who are choosing their local partners in the local arena and ask, well, what are the effects of these choices? They do have effects. When you go into rural West Africa, rural Latin America, wherever you go into a small community, even a large community, you're picking local interlocutors to interact with, whether they are local elected government, NGOs, private authorities. They have particular effects. For example, while democratic decentralization would indicate that decentralized interventions should be empowering elected local authorities, what we tend to find is that most of these powers tend to be transferred instead to line ministries, customary authorities, indigenous authorities, NGOs, and private corporations. These are not necessarily democratic decentralization, but that is what happens in its name. In approaching the problem of local democracy building, I use this word choice then to try and bring that responsibility up front, to say that those intervening have a responsibility to examine the effects of their interventions. And it's kind of modeled on Bob Bates's work in 1981, Markets and States in Tropical Africa, in which he looked at the instruments that governments chose for intervening, and he basically made the argument that governments choose instruments that serve their interests in consolidating power. And so we want to then look at the choices that governments, donors, and large NGOs make when choosing their local interlocutors. What is the instrumentality, but also what are the effects of those choices? So it's not just the choice of instruments, as in marketing boards, as Bob Bates looked at, but also what institutions do we interact with? What authorities do we interact with and produce in the process? The second term, recognition, is really about the effects of choice. And recognition, basically, we view choice as being complemented by recognition, where recognition is what the choice does. You give some powers to a local authority, that local authority has been recognized, whether it's just by working with them or transferring decisions to them. In some way, they are now the interlocutor, and they are empowered by this process. And I use the term recognition, which is borrowed from Charles Taylor, not the African Charles Taylor, but the political philosopher from Canada, borrowed from his work on multiculturalism. And it focuses attention on the effects of choices in a number of ways. I'm not going to get into them here, but basically when an institution is chosen as a recipient or a partner, that choice has deep effects on the institution, its powers, its accountability, and its legitimacy. And in turn, these effects shape forms of belonging and the freedoms and identities of those who belong to those particular institutions, and I'll get into that in a second. So the new research program looks at the effects of recognition by focusing on three elements of democracy. Representation. These are the three elements that we think are affected when local institutions are interacted with. Representation, citizenship, and what we're calling the public domain. Representation is kind of a trivial thing. You choose a representative institution, and ostensibly you are reinforcing representation. But in fact, it's not true, because if you choose them by transferring powers conditionally that you can take back, you can make a representative local institution upwardly accountable and not representative. So it's not so obvious. Secondly, people are often choosing a mix of local institutions, some of which are representative, some of which are not, with theories around pluralism, that competition will cause greater accountability and transparency, and these other institutions will hold local governments accountable. But there are other effects that we're seeing, that they take powers away from these institutions, they compete with them in ways that can undermine their legitimacy and their roles. So the institution you choose, or the mix of institutions, has an effect. Citizenship. Different local authorities imply different forms of belonging. And that is to say, a democratic local authority might base belonging, or normally would base belonging, on residency-based citizenship. All residents in an area belong under that representative authority. Whereas there are identity-based authorities, say customary chiefs that are based on language group or ethnicity or the like, or there are even outsider, insider, migrants, non-migrants. The authorities that may be formed around these particular identities are less inclusive. They include those of the same ethnicity, the same language, the same place of origin, and the like. Third, there are interest-based forms of belonging. An NGO. They're based on particular interests, say a profession or an interest in a forest. Those who belong to this particular NGO are only a small subsection of the population. So when you're empowering different groups, you're creating different forms of belonging that may be broader or narrower depending on the circumstance. So transfers to these authorities have different kinds of implications as you move along. Now, The last piece of this is the public domain piece. What happens to the public domain as you transfer powers from ostensibly central government, which are ostensibly public powers, to different institutions? And the framing of this, we tried to look at, if you transfer to local representative authorities, are you maintaining a kind of public domain? That is, domain of public interaction in which citizens can influence the use of the powers that are being transferred. If you're transferring to ethnic or identity-based authorities, are you in a certain way creating a kind of enclosure? You're desecularizing the powers to an authority who may not be influenceable by all actors, but by actors based on identity and their belonging under that authority. And third is, of course, the interest-based type of actor who may represent some form of enclosure, because you're taking a public power, and even if it's to an NGO that claims to be working on the public good, you're privatizing it in effect to that group, and their decisions are going to be based on the needs and aspirations of their members and not necessarily on the society as a whole. So those three effects were part of what we were looking for, and the 17 initial researchers in the program were asked to go in and take a look at what are the politics of choice in their cases. That is, why are large donors and NGOs and governments choosing particular interlocutors? And secondly, what are the effects of those choices? Or that is, what is the effect of recognition in terms of representation, citizenship, and the public domain? Now, of course, to go in and actually do this in case studies is virtually impossible in a short time. These were all fairly short-term case studies. It was a kind of reconnaissance to test out the framing. So what I want to do is I want to start by telling you a little bit about the prior program and the findings, because that informed the creation of the framing. That'll be a very brief run through some of the findings, and then get into a couple of examples from the current program. So, in our first Africa-centric program, most of the cases were in Africa, we found the following institutional choices were taking place in practice. All countries we looked at had local governments. Elected local governments were rarely being empowered, even when they were fairly democratic, well-structured. But in a lot of cases, electoral structures were such that they weren't really downwardly accountable. Winner-take-all lists, no independent candidates, which we considered also an institutional choice that was a choice not to really have representative authority, but to embed the local authorities within party systems in particular ways. We found a lot of deconcentration, that is, transfer to line ministry offices, an enormous amount of privatization going on, and examples would be hunting concessions in Senegal, land in South Africa, forests in Mali and Uganda, as well as in Senegal. And we found also that NGOs and community groups were being chosen by donors, even where there were democratic local authorities. This was causing competition with and delegitimating the local democratic authorities. A very little example would be beekeepers in Masindi district in Uganda, where the Forest Service came in and created a committee to manage beekeepers' entry into a park that they were living on the border of, rather than going to the elected village president. After they were given the right, they were told to defend the park against other actors in the community. They were said, you can use the park for your beekeeping if and only if you keep other people out, but we'll let you collect firewood and things like that too. Well, it split the village in half. There was a big conflict, and it was ultimately resolved when the village president was brought in. Those kinds of conflicts we saw also from the NGO, from settling on NGOs and working with NGOs, a real proliferation of committees, to the point at which there were professional committee members in every community. We saw a kind of pluralism that was being proclaimed, but the question wasn't being asked, what is pluralism without representation? When this plurality of local institutions is not subordinated in some way to a representative authority, it turned out to be kind of a formula for elite capture. in those areas. So the best organized institutions tended to capture the day. And basically, governments and donors were also, in the African context, choosing customary authorities, traditional chiefs. We also saw this in Latin America with indigenous authorities, but they were choosing to work with local chiefs, saying, well, they're legitimate, they know the landscape, they represent the people. And this was not quite clear in that they were making decisions in many of these contexts that were not decisions that local folks liked. We found that in Uganda, Mali, and Senegal, as well as in South Africa. And we did find they were often supported as well, not just by the donors and NGOs, but by central governments who were claiming to be the architects of their decentralization, that is, of the democratic local government. In general, the earlier research found that governments, donors, and international NGOs were producing what I'll call dependent authorities to manage rural subjects rather than enfranchising rural, lots of time left, rather than enfranchising rural citizens. We saw widespread enclosure of the public domain through privatization and desecularization of public powers. And these first findings inspired us to begin to ask, well, how do we begin analyzing and getting into this question of the construction of local democracy? So we set out to produce a framework, and then we set out to at least conduct some reconnaissance studies to test that framework. The select lessons from that first round, and I think they're somewhat raw lessons, from the 9 case studies that we really brought to completion that will be published, were that choice does matter. The institutions intervening in the local arena, their choices have an effect on the formation of local inclusion and decision-making practices. And the examples were in Guatemala, forestry officials worked through local government, but indigenous movements also claimed the right to make forestry decisions. And in this case, the Forest Service did transfer the rights to the indigenous movement to manage the forest. But it was at the expense of the elected local government. And it brought up a bunch of questions about, well, what are the long-term implications of the freedoms and rights of people who are, in some form or another, encapsulated under these non-elected authorities? The second case, I'm only taking a few of the cases. I'm not going to go through all 9. We wouldn't have time. In Brazil, the PT, or the Workers' Party, which is in power at present, worked with social movements, funding a federation that funded NGOs. They avoided the local elected governments on the basis that they were right-wing and represented the landed aristocracy. This outcome was, in the end, pro-poor, but also marginalized local elected government, and it marginalized local elected authorities who were also fairly populist in their makeup and that did represent local people well. So again, ambiguous as to what will the long-term effects be of these kinds of choices. In Karelia, in Russia, and we have Tomila Lankina here, who was the author of that case study and also a co-author on this. But since we didn't know until very recently that Tomila was going to be in town, she didn't end up on the panel. But she's here and will be able to answer and talk to us in the question and answer period as well. But in any case, the EU in this area invested in elected local governments. And this helped stave off attacks by the Kremlin against local government authorities. It enabled local elected officials to represent their populations on forestry and other issues. So again, a fairly positive example of a donor intervention. So these are cases where working with alternative authorities undermined local elected government, but there are also cases where they support it. But the majority are cases where they're undermining and avoiding local government. The second lesson I just have entitled, Institutional Pluralism Carries Risks. Theory indicates that there are democratic local governments, a plurality of parallel institutions, can either push local government to perform better through lobbying and accountability, or it can drain democratic authorities of the resources they need to act on behalf of local people, undermining not only their effectiveness, but in the long run, their legitimacy. So especially in the context of scarce resources, this has to be thought about. And we saw examples where authority was drained from elected local authorities due to outsiders choosing to work with all of the types of actors I mentioned earlier. And this was the case in Benin, in 2 small forests where the Forest Service chose to work through local committees and customary chiefs, even though the elected local authorities had been given that right, the right to manage forests, by law. And this basically marginalized the elected local councils, seriously undermining their ability to function. Similar dynamic you'll see in the case of Senegal that Solange will present. She may not get into that aspect, but that was also happening in Senegal. So a pluralist approach can be highly selective, where governments and other intervening agencies choose partners and represent the ruling class, that represent the ruling class or outside interests. And that was the case as well in the Indonesia case, what we're calling a selective civil society approach. Of course, governments and more powerful actors are going to select groups within society they think that will carry out their will. Therefore, civil society in this case is not a kind of representative set of actors. It's a select set of actors representing a select set of interests and has to be recognized as such. Public control of natural resource management fosters democracy. That was another lesson that we saw in some of these cases. Basically, retaining significant powers in the public domain can make a democratic local authority worth engaging with. People will go to them if they think they have some authority. And I think we see that in the India case that Ashwini will be presenting. And lastly, targeting is very important. An approach that says we're going to look at everybody equally and be neutral and gender neutral and caste and class neutral ends up reinforcing whatever structures are in place. And therefore, some form of affirmative intervention or action is necessary. And what we also found, which I'm not supposed to say because you're not supposed to say that your own work is successful, the framing is helpful. How's that? Basically, it does help identify some of the factors that are at play in the local arena that we don't fully yet understand how they all work and interact together, but I think we need to go deeper into these questions in order to not lose, in order to consciously produce the kinds of outcomes that we're hoping for. Now, the conclusion, the last page didn't print out for some reason, and so I just want to very quickly say that in the brief, we outlined some recommendations. And the one thing that I want to say about the conclusion that isn't here is that Nancy Fraser, political philosopher as well, talked about this question of choosing to empower local actors. She was talking in the multiculturalism context. And she said, essentially, we need some criteria that's open to public scrutiny, what she called participatory parody. That is to say, to explore whether or not the forms of authority and the actors we are empowering are creating some form of participatory parody, an openness in which all actors can influence outcomes. And rather than what the multiculturalist analysts have seen, a kind of reification of culture and of other actors that becomes exclusive, where one authority gets to define who belongs and who doesn't. So that was a helpful guide, and I think it's something we should take up. So I'm going to just read off the few core recommendations before passing the parole to my colleagues. And the recommendations we put here were: choose democracy. We don't know entirely how to do that, but to do it, we have to be very conscious. Choose to place democratic decisions with decision makers who are accountable and responsive. That's by definition democracy, according to many theorists. Accountability and responsiveness equals representation, that are accountable and responsive to local citizens. And where local government and such actors don't exist, we have to think carefully about how can we produce them. Build the public domain. That is, public powers that are the substance of public decision making. A local authority with nothing to give is not worth holding accountable. They have to have discretionary powers that are public and that can be influenced by people. The ability to influence them is called accountability. Some people think of it as sanction, the ability to sanction. So the third recommendation becomes build citizenship. And here that means support the right and provide the means for local people to influence the authorities that govern them and that hold these powers over resources and matters that are of significance to them, and promote equity. The point made earlier that affirmative interventions are necessary, not just a neutral approach to the rural, local arena. And I think there are others, but I think that's a good place to end, to pass the parole back to Jeff, see how you're going to go, whether there are questions or whether we go right on. I think the presentations.
Because we have such a rich panel, what we should do is have all the presentations and then put the discussion together. So Ashwini or Solange, I've forgotten who was going next.
We can Ashwini in the program.
Okay,
But
why don't you go ahead?
You can come over here.
You want to go over for the...
Back to the 21st century with Microsoft PowerPoint and some
I haven't gotten there
pictures.
yet.
I want to give you a sense of the place, but I want you to give a sense of the main argument more than the sense of the place. So what I'm going to try and do is talk more about the substance of the argument before delving very briefly into the case, and then leave it for later for questions to bring out more details about the particular case that I am talking about. I am talking about decentralization and working within the framework, the institutional choice and recognition framework, to think through what I call political articulation and its role in understanding outcomes related to democracy. My starting point here is that while community has become has always been has a central role in all discourse related to development over the last couple of decades in many forms, including large development such as big dams, all arguments related to decentralization implicitly assume that these communities are able to act collectively, and all it needs is to empower them, and then they will do whatever we want them to do. It assumes a certain level of local agency that is often present, but not always in the form that policymakers have assumed. The agency is most visually and vitriolically present in opposition to destructive development, where one sees the Narmada movement or the rubber tappers movement, the BR 364 against the rainforest destruction, where it gets to the front pages for a change, where communities get together, organize into social movements, and force the state, sometimes successfully, not always, in preventing destructive development. And very often, the discourse on community within decentralization draws upon those success stories in arguing and justifying how communities can do many things. So the question, therefore, is how does one enable this agency if it is assumed to exist? Well, what we see across many policies of decentralization, across sectors, across regions, countries, is that states are trying to re-centralize while decentralizing. They do not give sufficient powers to the entities to which they decentralize anything. There is a lot of debate now about the tyranny of conditional participation, where you can participate but on severe and restrictive conditions. There is, of course, decentralization to unrepresentative bodies, institutions, and authorities for instrumental reasons, that we want to conserve a national park and that is our main reason, so let's have some participation and community management of protected areas in the buffer zones. There is instrumental decentralization where the target of a central government is to increase the rates of immunization, for example, or XYZ, many other things, and you see a proliferation of committees. The Committee on Public Health, the Committee on Irrigation, Committee on Forests, Mothers and Teachers Association, and you name it, there are committees in a village. Yeah, and of course, if you throw a stone, it's likely to hit one or the other committee member of one of those committees. And it stands to reason that the local governments that are present in all these contexts and being ignored because of this instrumentalization of decentralization objectives are being attenuated. They are being delegitimized by this kind of recognition of alternative forms of participation, of exercising authority, of the locus of new powers. How far is that true? My question is, and this is where the case study begins, my question is, does it matter whether the new institutions that are created in the local arena exist in a wider democratic context? Does it matter that the decentralization is happening in Kazakhstan compared to India? Would it be the same? And the difference there, of course, is that a wider democratic context, which I think India is a good example of, also is witness to periodic, sometimes episodic, but certainly a significant amount of social and political mobilization. There is a lot of upheaval in society around issues. There are actors and agents and organizations who are trying to mobilize support for the claims that they are trying to make. There is thinking of democracy more broadly. There is freedom of association and several arenas where voice can be heard. In a democratic context, there are political parties that compete with each other for the honor of representation. And all of these add up to a pluralization of governance institutions, institutions that contribute to governance of forests or environment, broadly defined, so that local agency can be channelized through one or other mechanisms that are available in a democratic context. Such pluralization of the possibility of local voice being heard in larger arenas improves representation at all levels, and this articulation of interests in the larger democratic context makes it different in terms of the outcomes of decentralization, in terms of what we can expect from decentralization of any kind in a democratic context compared to a non-democratic or undemocratic authoritarian context. I claim, and this is a bold claim, and please feel free to challenge me on two of those that I'm making here, accountability of local governments cannot be conceptualized or analyzed separately from the accountability of other higher institutions of representation and governance. And I'm referring here only to the more formal democratic institutions of representation such as parliaments and local elected governments. Of course, representation is a many-splendored thing. It is multi-layered. It has its architecture. Representation has rules about who can represent, party lists, first past the post, proportional versus the other.
Winner take all.
It's not always winner take all, but yeah.
One of
And this architecture of representation, which is the structure of electoral institutions, determines how different interests in society can mobilize support and compete for representing those interests at multiple scales. Under certain circumstances, and these are the circumstances that I want to get at and I want to present as a possibility. Under certain circumstances, there is what I call vertical diffusion of accountability, so that institutions that are accountable at one level, representative and accountable and representative, so they are representative, governance institutions and so on, that they are accountable at one level and that accountability can be transferred because of this plurality of governance institutions, which provide a channel for voicing of local concerns. This is, of course, not possible in what I am calling disarticulated political systems, and I will get to that in a moment. Political articulation, this is a term that I'm working with and trying to develop. Political articulation can be defined as the degree to which citizens and citizen groups, not communities, citizens and citizen groups can influence policy through democratic institutions. And it is, of course, a working definition. I am still working with the project and see how it works when applied to a case. But the idea there is that one must think of accountability across scales of representation and accountability and responsiveness. Upward accountability has a bad press. Just like nobody thinks community can do any bad, nobody thinks upward accountability is good. I'm saying sometimes upward accountability is not only good, but just purely practical. In many cases, there is no other option. But if the higher levels are generally accountable, broadly democratically accountable within a democratic context, then upward accountability can contribute to a cross-scale construction of downward accountability of the same institutions over time. Because of the possibility of vertical diffusion, of citizens and citizens groups being able to influence decisions at one or another level. So if they can't influence it at one level because they are upwardly accountable for practical reasons or other ideological reasons or any others, as long as the levels above those institutions can be made accountable to whatever extent, it is possible to think of that system as being accountable and that accountability diffusing across scales. And elections play a very crucial, important role in this process, in this dynamic. Again, elections is another thing that has a very bad press, especially among development professionals. Elections are bad. Politicians are worse. Well, problem is, those are the only guys who are willing to represent. It's very difficult trying to get someone to stand for public office to represent a large group of people is not something that you find is very common anywhere. It requires a lot of hard work, it requires a lot of investment of time and resources, and it generates its own dynamic of patronage and corruption and so on. But in spite of all that, I think elections deserve a better press, especially when one sees elections at multiple levels, from the elected village government to the national parliament and several layers in between to which representatives are elected in periodic elections, repeated interactions over time, generates a different dynamic of accountability. And one tries to look at it temporally, cross-scale, then having representatives accountable at one level, the dynamic of elections helps to diffuse that accountability to scales above and below those levels. In this context, where, and this is the case that I'm talking about, India, where there is a wider democratic context that exists, there is a pluralization of channels for voicing local concerns. In such a context, decentralization can be seen as democratic space, as democratic opportunities, as an arena, as an act, as an event that can be used to improve political articulation in the system, articulation of local concerns and local voices. The architecture of representation, of course, matters a lot, so that proportional representation with closed party lists, such as Brazil has, doesn't do much to improve articulation. But the kind of institutions that India has is conducive to producing it. We see, in spite of that, we see a wide variation in the level of political articulation in India. And it is a function of the kind of competition that is generated between political parties. And of course, we have high articulation and low articulation. And I'm picking at one case that has very high articulation. Two parties that have been competing, very high level of political mobilization, that has resulted in some very high levels of human development indicators along both economic development and social welfare dimensions. In this context, there was a decentralization policy that came along as a constitutional amendment at the national level, not the state level. This is something that came from above, literally. It had to be implemented. There was no way around it. There was a new act in 1994 and new panchayats at the village level, and there were 3 tiers, but at the village level were elected in 1995 for the first time under this new empowered system, again in 2000, and for the last time before today in 2005. Now, as these institutions have evolved through successive election cycles, the fate of parallel institutions that have been imposed and that were present as a predominant form of decentralization in 1994 when they started, these parallel institutions have almost disappeared. Or where they exist anymore, they are subservient to the panchayats throughout the state. And I talk in very great detail in the paper in how this process over a 15-year, 10-year period actually makes the panchayats more accountable by enabling the panchayats, because of the new powers they have, to attract attention, to help citizens engage with the panchayats directly because they have something to give, and then use them as conduits to voice local concerns at higher levels, at the state level. This movement from a surfeit of parallel institutions and no powers to the panchayats to mostly working through panchayats has not just happened at the initiative of the state government alone, although the state government has been a big part of this. It has also been witnessed in how the donors have approached the issue of decentralization, and they are now in all new projects, including World Bank, DFID, you name it, prefer to work through elected local governments rather than trying to set up parallel bodies, which they preferred to do until 10 years ago. To conclude, what does it mean? What does the idea of the concept of political articulation do in furthering our application of the institutional choice and recognition framework? Well, one is that institutional choices are being made in a wider context. And whether that context is democratic or not makes a difference. Accountability must not be seen as the static content of decentralization policies that is in Article 13.2F of some new decree that has been passed. Accountability has to be constructed, both from below and from above, and it unfolds over time. And the extent to which certain institutional choices help to move that process in the direction, in a trajectory that improves accountability, is an empirical question that must be ascertained and is related to the choices that are made. We need to think of how community agency is being enabled by the act or by that choice, whether it is instrumental or whether the powers are being transferred to elected local governments. And the point here is that just because powers are transferred to elected local governments doesn't imply, and we should not expect, that they will become democratic. It is a process that unfolds over time. Some of them will, some of them will not, and it depends on the level of political articulation in the system that enables citizens and citizen groups to engage with these institutions of representation at multiple levels in making them representative and accountable. So these cross-scale dynamics, both spatial across scale and temporal over time, must be taken into account in thinking about the effects of the institutional choices that are being made. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. My case study is about the gender effect of institutional choice. The first question maybe would be, why gender matters in this topic. Gender matters because men and women have different relationships with institutions, either international organizations, central and local government, and traditional authorities. And also the way men and women have access to resources is different. And generally what happens is in environmental project design and implementation, these gender differences and power relations are generally inadequately addressed. And my claim is that while the strategies of intervening agencies rely on community participation in natural resource management, such approaches are insufficient for ensuring gender equity. There are a host of other locally specific factors that we need to take into account, and those factors, local factors, shape gender relations. If I take the case of Senegal, in 1996, the government put in place what it called regionalization, which means that the state has transferred power to local elected officials to be in charge of 9 functions, including natural resource management. And at the same time, you can see that we have decentralization in place, but also external agencies intervene at the local level. And when they intervene at the local level, they work with both elected officials and traditional leaders. So here we are seeing that there is a mix of approaches, participatory approach and decentralization, while these two approaches are different. Because when you talk about decentralization, you talk about elected officials, the transfer of power, and when you talk about participatory approaches, people are asked to be included, mainly the locals. And while these intervening agencies work with traditional leaders, they create what I call parallel institutions. And those parallel institutions are generally non-democratic. And what they create at the village level is what they call village committees. And if we consider traditional authorities in many African countries, rural countries, areas, and in Senegal, they are not generally accountable to the population. And also they have poor record in serving women's interest. That's why for these case studies, the two questions I'm asking are, how do institutional choices of village committees and electoral politics affect the gender distribution in decision-making processes? And also, what processes shape the gender distribution of voices and material benefit? And I'm looking at a specific case study in southeast of Senegal, the Malidino Reserve, which is here at the southeast, and it's located in the periphery of Niokolo-Kopa National Park, which is one of the biggest parks in Senegal and created during the colonial period. And at the community level too, in that area, you see the forest, the classified forest of Njambur, which is run by the Forest Service. And on top of that, we have this community-based reserve. So you can see that in that area how people are wedged into those protected areas, and also how land issue becomes a problem. Malidino Community-Based Reserve was created in 1997 by the World Bank and the Senegalese government, and it was run by the Forest Service. It has two main objectives: biodiversity conservation and rural poverty alleviation through income-generating activities and food and material distribution. The rural poverty alleviation activities were to help the locals to better take in charge natural resources. And for that, because it's a very poor and rural area, if they are given food or seed during a period of shortage, it will help them to better take care of the resources. So what they put in place is what they call the village approach. And the village approach means that the local are the one who will decide on how the reserve should be managed. And they will put in place their local rules and local regulation. And also they choose the actor that should be in charge of those of the reserve. And if you look at the reserve committees, the committees are comprised of traditional authorities such as village chief, imam, spiritual guides, and notables. The locals also were asked by the Forest Service to put in place a management charter, and that management charter is based on their own rules and regulation. But if you look at the charter, it includes sanction and prohibition against the population, but it does not include mechanism for the population to sanction the reserve leaders, mainly the traditional authority and the political party leaders. And when the reserve was created too, people were asked to abandon their cultivation land inside the reserve because it does not go well with biodiversity conservation. So they asked them to leave their land and promise them to have an animal park inside the reserve, and it will help them to create employment. At the beginning, it was difficult because the people are mainly farmers, but they did not have choice. They have to leave that area. So now I talk about how people work with traditional authorities and how they ask them to put in place their own rule. So now it is important to see what are the gender effect of that choice of working with traditional leaders at the local level. I will focus first on the issue of membership. Here you have the structure of the village committee. And if you look at the structure, just in terms of gender representation, you can see that only 5 women are part of this committee, which is composed of 20 members. And also, if you look at the executive board, only 1 woman is there, and they gave her the position of treasurer because they believe that women are the ones who can really take care of the finances. But by doing so, they exclude them from the main decision-making level. And also, you can see how women are confined into the subcommittees. And what are the gender outcomes also in terms of participation and representation in decision making? If we consider the committee and the way it functions, you can see that there is a reproduction of existing power structure. The same individuals who hold the leadership position in the village are the ones who are put in place in those village committee. And they are the ex officio members at the decision-making level. So we can see that all major existing power structures are reproduced in the reserve management. And generally, the women that we find in the village committee hold positions that are secondary or marginal in importance. And also, generally, they are put on papers. And this is due to the fact that the donor required the local to have a gender balance. To satisfy the donor requirement, they just put the women's name. But in reality, when I talk to women at the local level, some of them even did not know that they have a position into the committee. So you can see that, it's just a way of satisfying the donor requirement. And also, women's presence in the committee are generally based on kinship and friendship. The women are not elected by their peers, but they are co-opted by male leaders who are their parents, husband, or friend. And here you can see that if women are co-opted by male leaders, they tend to have this token representation because they have to follow the decision of those who co-opted them. And the wife and other female family members of the reserve leaders hold the position of authority over other women. So here also, even in terms of women's representation, we should ask, who are those women? Who are they representing? Are they representing women's interests or the male leaders' interests who happen to be their husband? And generally, those women who are co-opted, they largely legitimize men's decision rather than giving voice to the concern of other women. And one example, if we consider the reserve president, because there is one political leader who was selected to be the reserve president. The mother of the reserve president, who is considered to be an elder, holds a managerial position on the reserve committee. She is in charge of the finance. And also she is in charge of women's vegetable garden that is linked to the reserve committee. And she is the one who is in charge of distributing the food and seed supplies. The president's wife is the treasurer of the committee. And also the aunt of the president is responsible for the agricultural committee. So you can see here how that choice and cooptation really tend to put in place power, inequity, and inequality. And if we consider the reserve charter, no women leaders signed the reserve charter at a public meeting. This further illustrates the shallowness of their involvement in public meetings and in decision-making regarding the reserve rules. Another outcome is the gender, social, and political exclusions. At the beginning, I said that they asked the people to leave the reserve, their cultivation land. Some of the villagers resist abandoning their land inside the reserve for biodiversity conservation. But according to the reserve leaders, if they abandon those fields in the reserve, they will be conserving the reserve in compliance with the wishes of the Forest Service, and there will be additional projects that will benefit the population. However, that decision was detrimental to the farmers, but they did not have any choice, but just accept what the leaders and the Forest Service wanted. And one man that I interviewed said, we abandon our land contrary to our own wishes and without any compensation. And this quote reflects the experience of many people at the village level. There were also exclusions from the poverty alleviation benefit based on kinship. When the food and seed supply arrive at the local level, the reserve president serves first his own family and also people who belong to his own political parties. Those who belong to the other political party or does not belong to his family are not really represented. So while some families are partially or completely excluded from food and seed supply, each individual member of the president's household and those of other family were enjoying his favoritism. This discrimination in the distribution of donor-provided resources helped the enrichment of some families while impoverishing others. Ethnicity also come into play when it comes to the food distribution. And in that area, we have two main ethnic groups, the Fulani and the Mandingo. And the Fulani in that village represent the majority. And the reserve president and most of the reserve leaders are from the Fulani. And in that village, you can find a household, Mandinka household. And at the beginning, they were receiving, but because of political issues, they were excluded from receiving those supplies. And also one wall of family were there, and the man said that he felt to be excluded because of his ethnic group. And these types of exclusion and marginalization led to the creation in 2004 of a new social and political association. And that new political and social association was created by a newly elected councillor who happened to be from the opposition party, which is different from the one that the reserve president is. This division was also reproduced among women following the lead of their male relatives, and also it split women along the same party line and fragmentation of their traditional solidarity. We know that at the local level, women's associations are very powerful, and they work together to see how they can survive or how they can develop some mechanism to really help each other. But because of the political rivalries and competition among the men, women in that area, they tend to follow their men's decision, and whatever their husband said, they have to follow that. And you can see that if men are divided, it reflects automatically to women's all right, thanks. And some women also were excluded from the food because they did not belong to the same political party of the reserve president. And you can see that this form of exclusion show that gender problematic does not only imply power relations between men and women, but also imbalances in power relations among women as well, because women who belong to the same association were excluded by some women's leaders. However, this shows a picture where really people were excluded, but also there are some cases where people develop some resistance mechanisms to really show their disagreement about what was going on. And in conclusion, based on those facts that came out from the case studies, we can say that this case study has shown how parallel local institutions, as they relate to party and electoral politics in local council, have served to reproduce inequity and exclusion by privileging the social and cultural rules and code through which power relations operate in the rural communities surrounding the reserve. The gender effect of externally driven intervention of government and donor intervention have reproduced combined effect on authority and power, on social, cultural, and gender power dynamics in the context of emerging competitive politics. And also, parallel institutions have reproduced and deepened extant social hierarchies in the rural communities surrounding the reserve. At the same time, government and donor interventions provided alternative sources of power and authority to those deprived of legitimacy in the context of electoral politics. The new resources were used to channel patronage and punish political opponents. Not only did this dynamic fail to rectify extant inequalities between and among women, but they served to deepen them, generating resistance among women. So these are the three main conclusions that I drew from this case study. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Solange. I think we'll turn to Uma and to Andrew for some brief discussion comments, and then we'll turn it open to the floor.
Am I first? Sorry, I was thinking you were first, so I was. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. I first thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure for me. I've been interacting with Jesse a little bit and trying to pick his brain, and he was telling me he was very busy, he didn't have time, and so he thought maybe this is the best way for me to read everything he's working on, obviously a lot. And I should say two things in my comments. First of all, my comments are from the perspective of a consumer of what they are producing. Consumer, because I am doing an evaluation of the World Bank's 2002 forest policy. And I had also done an evaluation of the 1991 forest policy of the World Bank, which had concluded that that forest policy didn't really work very well because it had an exclusive focus on conservation without paying much attention to the issues of poverty and forest-dependent people, etc. And besides, developing countries, especially those that were rich in forests, had different objectives than the global community did. And so there was a great tension between the large forest-rich countries like Brazil, Indonesia, etc. And we had concluded that, quite ironically, the banks seemed to be making more headway in countries that didn't have huge forests, that it was more successful in China and more successful in India because they were at a stage of their development where they had lost most of their forest, and there was much more desire on the part of various people to try to rebuild the forest. So we were looking at it in terms of transition of countries from being forest rich to being forest poor, and then trying to see how they can become forest rich again, which has happened in more industrialized countries. Well, the new policy was put in place in 2002, which has objectives which are very pertinent to what these people have been working on, which is to see what is the potential of forests to reduce poverty and forest-dependent people, how to integrate forests in the sustainable economic development of countries, and the third is how to reconcile the local and global environmental objectives. So that's the 2002 forest policy, which I'm currently evaluating to see how has the implementation of that policy gone, progressed, I mean. And then in the meantime, after this policy was put in place, as you probably know, there is great interest in forests right now because of climate change issues. And there are several major initiatives to see what one can do to avoid deforestation. And so there are lots of funds that donors are making available to something called RED, which is reduced deforestation and degradation. And the idea is that many of the lessons that have been learned in the 90s and 80s probably on payments for environmental services, which are being implemented in several countries, Costa Rica being very much at the cutting edge of having developed this innovation. What can one learn from it to try to reduce the loss of carbon from forests in the world? And so there is a huge debate going on at the moment in the development community, in the climate change community, on how to reconcile all these different interests, global interests and local interests. Well, I should say global, national and local interests. Also, how to reconcile the concerns about climate change, which are focused very much on carbon, as distinct from the concerns of biodiversity conservation, which have led to a lot of international conventions, which created the GEF, establishment of GEF, and gave it a mandate to implement that, to compensate developing countries over a fixed period of time for helping them to conserve biodiversity. And then, of course, there is the fact that the 32 biodiversity hotspots in the world contain at least 1 billion people, and most of them there's tremendous population pressure in those areas. So what does one learn from this experience of interventions of all kinds in different parts of the world is something that I'm working on at the moment. So I have been reading these papers with considerable amount of interest, and I think I'm going to pose more questions than give you answers, but that's one perspective that I come from. The second is, this will tell you how ancient I am, because in the 1960s, my ex-husband, who is a political sociologist, was doing work on democratic decentralization in our state, in Maharashtra, while I was doing my PhD thesis on the grain markets in Maharashtra. And that is when the talk of decentralization to the districts started in India in the 1960s. And he was looking at the political capture, or the political elite at the district level, and how they were multiple entrepreneurs. So they were, they were significant in the sugar estates in Maharashtra, which was a very thriving business, but they were also very good political entrepreneurs with connections with the legislative assemblies, with the national government, how they emerged as national leaders, etc., etc. And since in the 70s I was working on Africa, and then people like Leonard and Bob Bates and others with whom I collaborated on my work in Africa, where we were looking at the dynamics of decentralization in Tanzania, for instance, because McKinsey, of all the places, helped the government of Tanzania to decentralize. They also helped the World Bank to decentralize. And we were looking at the consequences of decentralization, the tension between the party TANU, as distinct from the deconcentration, and the political leaders, the administrative ministries, charges going down, etc. And I think, so based on this history, my interest has been twofold. One is to see what can I learn from their studies for the charge that I have. And the second is to say, what can I say about what have we learned in the last 30, 40 years of my own professional career, which is quite long. And I think in that context and some other publications that I've been doing, I've been looking at the literature, and what I find is that, there is a great deal of literature that donors have done, including by the World Bank, on the whole question of creating parallel institutions. And the former head of the Operations Evaluation Department, for whom I was working, has written some very articulate things about why donors create parallel institutions. And I don't want to be simplistic and do injustice to what he has said, which is much more sophisticated than what I'm going to say now. But basically, he's been saying, and I've noticed this in my own experience in Africa over the last 35 years, is that there are concerns on the part of donors for fiduciary accountability. So you create institutions where you have a comfort zone that, in terms of fiduciary accountability, financially, where did the resources go, you will be able to create an institution that is more accountable than what are seen to be the local institutions that are weak in many countries, and fiduciary accountability is not as strong as it could be. The other is that there is a lot of pressure on showing results. And I think, if anything, that pressure has increased over time, in part because of the disenchantment that, there's a lot of foreign aid that's going out, but what can we show for it? And so, in a way, quite paradoxically, the mechanisms that the donors often create are a result of the fact that they want results and they want to see where their money went, and they create these institutions. And I think study after study, the findings have been that parallel institutions undermine often the existing institutions. I mean, for somebody like me who's been in this field, we've known that for a long time. I just found a wonderful statement that Larry Summers, the former chief economist of the bank and secretary of treasury, etc., had made to the country directors, saying that he was very reticent about the big push on community-driven development because it can undermine existing institutions. So we have to be really careful about what does that all mean. So I think from this point of view, my question is, I'm not surprised that women are not playing much of a role. I went to my own state to look at some of the bank-funded projects in forestry, and they told me there were women on the committees, and I asked, where are the women? And they said, well, they're all busy doing. I said, no, I want to see the women because I can even talk their language. I come from there. So I did meet with the women and found that they were not playing such any role, actually, that I could see. But the fact that there is elite capture, that there is parallelism, that often parallelism undermines institutions, etc., is, if I may say so, fairly well known in the profession. Mm-hmm. I think the question is, what does it all mean? And, those of us who try to straddle two fields, being analysts on the one hand, but also trying to look at operational issues in terms of what does it mean? What can we say the bank could do differently than it does now? So I'm looking at your work from that point of view. And I think I'm glad, Jesse, that you talked about the framework approach, because I think that can be very useful. And I urge you to develop that framework approach, because I think there is a general recognition that many donor institutions have been dominated by economists. There are very few political scientists in those institutions. There are very few sociologists also. And what happens is that each one of us tries to look at the problem from our own perspective. If we are political scientists, we look at the politics. If we are economists, we look at the returns. If we are biologists, we look at what biodiversity was conserved. And one of the problems that I'm finding is that there is no integration of these concerns. But the policy was meant to be integrative. It was to say, how can we achieve poverty reduction at the same time that we do biodiversity conservation? And the question now for me is, has that been possible? And if it isn't possible, what were the outcomes? And here I was therefore looking for some evidence, because I see that there is mention of virtual cycles, virtual circles, etc. And I was looking for what kind of a virtual circle. And from a political science perspective, articulation and upward, downward accountability, etc., can be seen as a virtual circle. But I think we need to define our terms very, very clearly. What kind of virtues are we talking about? And can we say something about what the outcomes are? I mean, we know, for instance, in India, we've had democracy in India for 60 years. We are very proud of it. But local level democratic decentralization was introduced in 1994, the elections at the local level. But the democracies existed a national election since 50s. So I think sometimes what has happened is that the absence of institutions in developing countries has made donors choose whatever institutions that were available. And if they found that they were not very effective, then to try and create something like bring some NGOs and see if they can stimulate civil society participation. So if we don't look at why, and I was looking for what do you say about why the donors are doing what they are doing, which you said, JC, you were going to address, but I did not see as much of why the donors are doing what they are doing, but it is a question that I've been wrestling with for a long time. And I know that there are good reasons why they do it. I'm not justifying the outcomes. And I think in many cases what they are involved in with large sums of resources is social engineering of a very complex nature, where there is intense competition for resources and tremendous conflicts for resources, not just external, but for land and political competition, etc. And I think that, you know, the instruments that donors have at their disposal to deal with these very complex social issues that you're describing, in terms of what does that mean for whether we can get better outcomes on poverty reduction and on biodiversity conservation. Can we achieve the global objectives of climate change and biodiversity at the same time we make the lives of these poor people more attractive or more palatable? You know, those are the big questions that we are facing, and those are going to be more intense, those questions, than they are now. And we are all looking for answers. And so I would like more for you to say more about what were the poverty outcomes. Was there a trade-off between conservation and development? For instance, the eco-development project in India. Did it achieve the objectives of the project, or did it just increase political participation? I'm not necessarily convinced that there is no elite capture in democracies. We see it all the time. So, and many of the committees, for instance, in Indonesia, I was involved in a country assessment evaluation in Indonesia. The democratic decentralization was proceeding in Indonesia at the same time that the bank was already acting there. The same in Brazil when I was working there. So what happens is donors are working in a process which is long-term and dynamic. You can see how long-term it is in India. And so they have to choose some institutions which are imperfect because the local governments don't work, don't exist. The government of Indonesia in the 90s had not yet even clarified, after the financial crisis, what the big bang decentralization was going to mean. Everybody in the bank was searching for it to say, what does it mean? What's the government's ideas? What are the government's ideas? But also then to operationalize those ideas in reality in a country that has not had local democracy takes decades, if not centuries. And so, you know, it's in that context that we are trying to achieve results in the short run on poverty reduction, conservation, etc. And I think your framework, and when do we know, how do we go about making choices of what institutions one should choose in different circumstances? How can we develop indicators on what progress we are making to say that, you know, we are creating effective institutional pluralism rather than just talking about it? What is that likely to do in terms of outcomes on biodiversity conservation, poverty reduction, etc.? I think that would be very useful. You have probably far more material than you could present, but I look forward to looking at it with great interest. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to be extremely. It's on the bottom. I'm going to be extremely brief. I have We've had some very great presentations. I know everyone wants to get into the discussion here, so I'm going to make 2 points in 2 minutes, if that's okay. We've been doing at the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center a series of things on democratic governance. One has been looking at decentralization and democratic governance, and we have a book coming out on participation and representation. And just 2 points that come out of that, which I think check very well with what's been said here today, 2 theoretical points from a Latin American context. One is that, participatory democracy, the idea of institutions that encourage participation, are normally very attractive. I mean, there's lots of reasons. They expand the horizons of democratic practice. They allow democracy to become closer to people. People become more directly engaged, redress some of the imbalances that are involved in representative mechanisms sometimes. However, increasingly in the discussion on participation, we've moved away from the discussion on representation. And what we really want, the kind of discussion we should be having on participation, is how do participatory mechanisms really fit into representation? How do they support and not bypass representation? What you tend to end up with is mechanisms that actually either undercut representation or sometimes strengthen executives or higher levels of government that have then 2 parallel mechanisms to deal with. They can sort of play them off against each other. So the real debate we should be having on participatory democracy is how do those participatory institutions, whether it's watershed management or it's participatory budgeting in Brazil or participatory planning in Mexico, are the kinds of things that actually support representation. There's one corollary on that, and that is sometimes when, and Ashwini referred to this, where the country is not democratic, where national institutions aren't democratic, there are some advantages to having local participation as a way of creating accountability that you may be able to expand at a time of democracy, but those are specific situations. Second point is, and this is in their report, I just wanted to agree with it, is that where representation exists and there's an attempt to create participation to support that, it's still very important. Rarely in countries that have come out of authoritarian experiences does representation work as well as it should, even in this country at times, we could say. And so strengthening citizenship and civil society, both looking at horizontal linkages among citizen organizations, building relationships which are often fragmented, and what Ashwini referred to as political articulation, vertical linkages between civil society and political parties and the political sphere. Often we think of civil society as kind of pure and separate, and I think you guys make a great point of the need to get civil society immersed in representation in politics. It doesn't mean they turn into parties, but that you don't think of them as completely separate. Participation is part of representation. Conclusion of all this is thinking of participatory innovation as something that can expand the horizons of democracy. It's important to think about these things, but we want to think about them really in the context of representation. We don't want to divorce it from that, and we want to think about it in the context of building a stronger civil society that is linked to the representative realm as well.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you all. It's obviously, there's a lot there and very rich set of observations. Why don't we take some questions? And I appreciate all your patience, but you've obviously stayed with us because it's quite interesting stuff. My colleague has a microphone that will bring it to you for posing the questions. Who would like to kick us off? No? Yes, gentleman here and then down front.
Good afternoon. I'm from the Embassy of Mexico. My name is Jorge Navarro. I just have a question out of curiosity. You talk about democratization and local authorities, but according to the current history, latest issue, they said that the majority of the governments in Africa are not democratic, or the presidents are more than 15 years in power. So how you can put in the level or local level democratization when in fact they don't have this culture of democratization as we see it through this magazine that they are talking about this situation. Thank you.
One of you like to respond to that, or should we take a couple?
Take a
Leon,
few.
why don't you bring it up here, the gentleman in the front?
Can people say their names too? I didn't get it.
My name is Ed Connerly. I work for USAID on local governance issues. And I want to, this notion of representation that's come up, I want to kind of question the concept of representation that seems to be the center of the presentation, in the sense that it all seems to be, I understand representation when you use the phrase or the word to mean sort of the one person, one vote kind of aspect of democracy. What I wanted to raise was the example of federal countries in which usually one representative body is designed to represent the interests of the rich, and therefore sort of undermines the concept of representation that I thought was at the center of the presentation.
Why don't we, would you
Those are good.
like
Yeah.
to respond to those? Yeah.
Okay, let me take a crack. I think there are many. I'll start with the last one first because it's a matter of definition. In the framing, I use Adam Jaworski's notion of representation, where representation is accountability and responsiveness, where accountability is about the presence of the potential to sanction, and responsiveness is about having the power to respond. That power can be internal powers like knowledge and skills, or external powers like money, resources, and the ability to mobilize others. So accountability plus responsiveness. But you can have representation as well without accountability. It's called benign dictatorship, where it may, in fact, have the responsiveness aspect, according to him, but we don't call it democratic. And that is one that history has pretty much shown wanders off the path of actually even being responsive. But that's the basic definition, is a substantive definition and not a procedural definition. And I think that may get around that conceptual hurdle. The other issues, they're very interesting questions that have been brought up. Why donors do not or do choose parallel institutions? In addition to this program, there's been a number of programs before, including an evaluation of CDD programs at the World Bank, where I did interview a number of people at the bank, but I've also interviewed a number of donors. One is many donors do not have a theoretical idea of the link between their intervention and outcomes, in terms of knowing that they may not know something as simple as ideas of better matching resources to outcomes might come from being more local, a kind of public choice theory. They may not have an internalizing externality model. Not all are economists, and that most economists would know about. They may not know the new institutionalist theories that say you're going to reduce transaction costs by having certain kinds of institutional configurations. That was true. But what I found more interesting was a lot of people come, not just donors, but international NGOs, come in saying, we don't want to work with government because government's corrupt. It's a kind of Thatcherist, Reagan-esque idea that government is bad, and we have to go towards civil society, and that we throw everything at civil society. It's what I called a naive civil society approach. That's very widespread. Choosing for results, so expediency. I say choosing for results because I think the managing for results framework has driven donors in many ways toward a very pointed kind of go to whoever has the skill to intervene for you, which often ends up being private groups on contract. So you're getting a civil society middle class emerging that is really a service sector. It's kind of melding. So those are some of the reasons. I mean, it's so hard because you can't get under the surface of these things very fast. I won't go further with that. But there are other reasons that popped up. Those were some of the more salient ones. Integration that you brought up, Uma. Integration, I think, does require representation because the needs and aspirations of those who are local, if not somehow channeled into the process, are not going to influence the decisions. That's difficult because it requires then power to counterbalance the knowledge that is power to actually impose that local will, which is often not present. It comes back then to what Andrew was saying about bringing representation back in and trying to continuously cultivate those representative local authorities, at least to get that voice in the process. I think more has to happen, such as significant transfers, but those don't happen because the people who have to transfer them, as we always say, the rich and powerful don't like to give up their wealth and power. Audience, Jorge Navarro. You're right. Most of the African governments are not democratic. Some are. They are to different degrees. but I wouldn't call that a lack of a culture of democracy. I think there are many cultures of democracy within Africa at many different scales. I do think that one of the problems we do see in decentralization in Africa is that even though there are well-structured local elected authorities in places like Mali, like Uganda, like Senegal, they don't receive the powers that the laws actually written say they should get, mainly because of another problem, and that is line ministry hegemony. And that line ministry hegemony is due to the fact that you have executive regimes. So it is, in fact, tied to the non-democratic nature, and legislatures that barely have anything to say, very rarely introducing legislation even, so and very rarely monitoring the implementation of programs through line ministries. And I think you have to go back to the colonial period and look at the construction, at least in forestry and natural resources, of the line ministries on the ground to understand their complete monopoly over the not only the management but over the distribution of income and wealth from various resource sectors. So those would be my quick responses. Do you guys want to jump in on any of the questions, or Tomila?
Yeah, I just have a very quick observation because I have to rush off in a few minutes.
1 second, get you the microphone.
Sorry.
I just wanted to respond a little bit to Uma's comment about whether we have outcomes and what kind of indicators we're using. You're right that it's a very short period of time. We're talking about only about 10 years of decentralization. So I think in a way it's a work in progress. However, some of our case studies do have information about or some kind of attempts at measurements or in a systematic way evaluating of what kind of outcomes there are as a result of specific institutional choices. And I can say for the case study on Russia, how the donors, in this case the European Union's choice to work with local governments, actually strengthen these institutions. And we have specific systematic evidence of how this support for local democratic institutions then helped them mount a challenge to the authoritarian government of President Putin. So that's an example of how sort of support for specific institutions then translates into outcomes that could have implications for the national level. And I don't know, maybe Jesse or Ashwini could have examples from the other case studies of this kind of more systematic evidence. Thank you.
Ashwini or
There were two general thoughts that melded into one in response to the comments and questions. One is, there will be elite capture. There was elite capture, there will always be elite capture. The question is whether the elites can be held to account what they are capturing or not. I think I mentioned it in my presentation. Poor people do not have the time to sit on committees. Please let us spare them. The question is whoever is sitting on the committees, whether they are accountable to whatever powers they have been given to do. As long as we can enable that, I don't care whether the elites are sitting on the committees or not. They will always sit on committees.
Oh, man.
We are elites. Who are we kidding? But generally, Uma used this phrase that I'm going to jump on, no offense. They choose imperfect institutions. This is the holy grail of development, the perfect institution.
Getting the institutions.
We are not going to get it right. There is no such thing as a perfect institution. There is always.
Choose the word imperfect.
I'm basically misrepresenting what you said.
Because sometimes institutions are weak, so they try to choose between whatever they think exists, which is not the same as they're looking for a perfect institution.
I may have not been listening carefully. You just use the term imperfect institutions, and I'm just taking it off from there and making my own point. It's just a hook to hang it. Okay. But the idea of democracy and why it is so icky is that it is a mess. It is completely unpredictable. There is no guarantee that this kind of local democracy will not end up in Hindu-Muslim riots in some village. It has happened. It has been known to happen. It happens everywhere. Other kinds of cleavages come up. there is no guarantee that, certainly I do not start with this assumption that democracy is this nice, good thing that we should all aim for. It is not the nice, good thing. All it promises is that if some groups, not just individuals, but groups, feel that they are being excluded and would like to have their voice heard, there are multiple ways, not just one, multiple ways, multiple channels for those voices to be heard at multiple scales. It is just a mechanism, the best that we can do at the moment for making that possible. And the advantage of doing that, instead of trying to, as I said, instrumentalize it through outcomes, is that there will be only one committee for drinking water. There will be only one committee for whatever else the committee is for, and nowhere else. So if you are excluded from that committee because it is captured by someone, you're out of luck. No water for you. And democracy, no matter how messy it is, as long as it provides those multiple channels, more people will get water. That's all that I was trying to say. And we need to think about it.
Barbara? I think we'll have to...
Solange.
Oh, okay. Why don't we take Barbara's question and then we'll give a final wrap-up because we're coming at the end.
Yeah, this has been very fascinating, but getting into Barbara Best from USAID, the Natural Resources Management Office. So coming from a donor perspective, what should we have done? Maybe we could take the case of Senegal. You pointed out where the donor had used the traditional village leaders. What would have worked better in that case? We get a view as to how we should approach this, and particularly when you have you have women and other marginalized groups involved. So that was my thought.
Terrific. That's a good lead-in.
Yeah, I think it's a good connection. So I will try to answer the rationale for choice. So why are they choosing? I asked that question to the Forest Service agent. So they gave me two main reasons. The first one is that they want to work with local people with whom they used to be in conflict because those people live in protected area, and we know the history of Forest Service agent and people living in local area. So they say now we want to have this village approach and try to see how we can work in partnership with the locals. And the second reason is that they believe that local elected officials are corrupted, and also they're really driven by patronage and they're not really accountable to the local, which is really true. But if you look at the effect of choosing to work with traditional leaders, it comes with gender effect and it creates social inequity and inequality. So my question is, it's not about why they're doing that, but what are the outcomes of what they're doing, and how can we learn from those outcomes and try to come up with some solutions. And in my dissertation, I tried to look at both decentralized institution and participatory approaches. And it comes out that they all have the same effect of undermining women's ability to collectively address their interests. So you can see now, you can ask, what am I going to choose since they have the same effect? But I'm saying that decentralization has the potential because we have legal framework that, for example, a marginalized group like women can use, for example, to be elected. And if you have, for example, like more women involved in decision making, their interests can be taken into account. And beyond the numbers also, the issue of accountability can be taken into account, and it can really bring change in terms of including marginalized groups.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of the period, but we obviously have not come to the end of the discussion. And certainly we will have so much rich material that comes out of these research programs and these papers. I urge you to pick up the ones that are out